Welcome, traveller of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day, or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe, connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. Now, most people think they know about the opium trade. They picture smoky dens and Chinese addicts, maybe some vague notion of the Opium Wars. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. The real heart of the global opium empire wasn't in China at all. It was beating right here in Calcutta, pumping poison through the veins of the British Empire. And when cholera arrived to crash this party, it didn't just kill people. It exposed the rotten foundation that everything was built on. But before we dive into how these two monsters fed off each other, let me paint you a picture of just how insane this whole operation was. By the 1830s, the British weren't just selling opium. They had turned it into the most sophisticated drug cartel in human history, complete with government backing, military protection, and a distribution network that would make modern cartels weep with envy. And the profits? We're talking about numbers so astronomical that they literally funded the entire British presence in India. Every road, every fort, every colonial administrator's salary was paid for with opium money. The East India Company wasn't just complicit in drug dealing, they were the drug dealers. Now, you might be wondering how cholera fits into this story of imperial drug dealing. Well, here's where it gets really dark. When cholera hit Calcutta, it didn't strike randomly. It followed the same paths as the opium trade, the same crowded neighborhoods where addicts gathered, the same unsanitary conditions that the British had created to maximize their profits while keeping their own communities safe. Let me introduce you to someone who saw this nightmare unfold firsthand. His name was James Jameson, and no, not the whiskey guy. This James Jameson was a Scottish doctor who arrived in Calcutta in 1831. Just months before cholera would transform the city into a living hell. Jameson came to India with noble intentions. He wanted to help people, to use his medical training to make a difference in the colonies. What he found instead was a city where the British had created two parallel worlds. There was the gleaming European quarter, with its wide streets and proper drainage, where British merchants counted their opium profits in marble mansions. And then, there was the other Calcutta, the one where most people actually lived. Jameson's first assignment was in Burra Bazaar, right in the heart of the opium district. The East India Company had established their main opium processing and storage facilities here, turning what had once been a thriving local market into something that resembled a cross between a pharmaceutical factory and a medieval dungeon. The smell hit you first, Jameson would later write in his journals. Not just the opium, though that was overwhelming enough, it was everything else that came with it. The unwashed bodies of addicts who hadn't left the warehouses in days. The rotting food that merchants sold to people too high to notice it had gone bad. And underneath it all, something else. Something that seemed to seep up from the very ground. That something was the beginning of cholera, though Jameson didn't know it yet. The disease had been brewing in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions that the opium trade had created. See, when you pack thousands of people into spaces designed for hundreds, when you prioritize profit over basic human needs, when you create a population of addicts who can't take care of themselves, you're essentially building a perfect breeding ground for epidemic disease. But here's what made the situation in Calcutta uniquely horrific. The British weren't just ignoring the public health crisis they were creating. They were actively making it worse because doing anything to fix it would hurt their opium profits. Let me tell you about Ramesh Chandra, a Bengali clerk who worked in one of the opium warehouses. Ramesh wasn't an addict himself, but his job was to keep track of the inventory. As raw opium came in from the poppy fields, and processed opium went out to the ships bound for China. He was basically a middle manager in history's largest drug operation. Ramesh lived in a small room above the warehouse with his wife and 2 young children. The family had moved to Calcutta from a small village, chasing the promise of steady work and better opportunities. What they found was steady work, all right, but at what cost? Every morning, Ramesh would wake up to the sight of addicts collapsed in the alleyway below his window. Some were British sailors who had jumped ship to feed their habits. Others were local labourers who had started using opium to cope with the brutal working conditions in the warehouses and docks. Many were Chinese workers who had come to Calcutta as part of the growing trade network, only to become trapped in the very addiction they were helping to fuel. But it wasn't just the addicts who suffered. The entire neighbourhood had become a cesspool of human misery. The British had built their opium warehouses with no regard for sanitation or proper drainage. Waste from the processing operations flowed directly into the streets. The Hooghly River, which provided drinking water for much of the area, was contaminated with runoff from the opium facilities. And then there were the rats. Oh, the rats. They were everywhere, feeding on spilled opium and anything else they could find. These weren't just ordinary rats, though Ramesh and his neighbours didn't know it at the time. These were the advanced scouts of cholera, carrying the disease in their guts as they scurried between the warehouses and the residential areas. Ramesh first noticed something was wrong in late 1831. People in his neighbourhood started getting sick with a strange illness that seemed to come out of nowhere. One day they'd be fine. The next they'd be doubled over with cramps and diarrhea so severe it could kill them within hours. The British authorities knew about these isolated cases, of course. Dr. Jameson and other medical officers filed reports describing the symptoms and the alarming mortality rate. But here's the thing that will make your blood boil. The East India Company's response wasn't to investigate the cause or improve conditions in the opium district. Instead, they tried to cover it up. Why? Because any official acknowledgement of an epidemic would have meant quarantine measures, shipping delays, and most importantly, interrupted opium profits. The company was making so much money from the opium trade that they literally couldn't afford to let a little thing like a mysterious disease get in the way. So they classified the reports, transferred doctors who asked too many questions, and instructed their administrators to downplay the severity of the situation. They even went so far as to blame the victims, claiming that the deaths were caused by the moral weakness of opium addicts rather than any environmental factors. But diseases don't respect cover-ups or profit margins. While the East India Company was busy protecting their opium revenues, cholera was spreading through Calcutta like wildfire through a drought-stricken forest. The first major outbreak hit in February 1832, right in the heart of the opium district. Within days, what had been isolated cases became a full-blown epidemic. The disease struck with a violence that terrified even experienced doctors like Jameson. Victims would wake up feeling fine and be dead before sunset. The cholera would start with mild stomach discomfort, then escalate to violent cramps and projectile vomiting. But the real horror was the dehydration. Patients would literally waste away before your eyes, their skin turning blue-grey as their bodies lost massive amounts of fluid. Jameson found himself treating dozens of cases every day, most of them in the cramped, airless rooms above the opium warehouses. He quickly realized that the disease was spreading through contaminated water, but when he tried to get the authorities to shut down the affected areas and clean up the water supply, he hit a wall of bureaucratic resistance. The East India Company officials told him that closing the opium warehouses, even temporarily, was out of the question. Too much money was at stake. Ships were waiting in the harbour to take processed opium to China, and any delay would cost the company thousands of pounds. So the warehouses stayed open, the addicts kept coming, and cholera kept spreading. Ramesh watched helplessly as his neighbours died one by one. First, it was the old man who sold rice in the morning market. then the family with 3 young children who lived 2 doors down. Then Ramesh's own wife started showing symptoms. Her name was Kamala, and she was 24 years old when cholera took her. She died on a Tuesday morning in March, holding Ramesh's hand and asking him to take care of their children. By Thursday, both children were showing symptoms. By the following Monday, Ramesh was alone. But here's what makes this tragedy even more infuriating. While people like Kamala and her children were dying in the opium district, the British merchants who profited from their misery were safe in their marble mansions just a few miles away. The European quarter had proper sewage systems, clean water supplies, and immediate access to medical care. When cholera did occasionally cross into the European areas, it was quickly contained with quarantine measures and sanitation efforts that were never extended to the native population. The message was clear. British lives mattered. Indian lives were expendable, especially if protecting them might interfere with opium profits. Dr. Jameson tried to document this disparity in his reports to the colonial government. He pointed out that the mortality rate in the opium district was nearly 10 times higher than in the European quarter. He provided detailed evidence showing how the unsanitary conditions around the warehouses were accelerating the spread of disease. The response was swift and brutal. Jameson was reassigned to a remote military outpost on the Afghan frontier, effectively ending his career in colonial medicine. His replacement was a company man who understood that his job wasn't to heal the sick, but to keep the opium flowing and the profits growing. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the cholera outbreak. Any doctor, administrator, or journalist who tried to connect the epidemic to the conditions created by the opium trade found themselves transferred, demoted, or simply ignored. Meanwhile, the disease continued its rampage through Calcutta's most vulnerable populations. The addicts were hit especially hard, not just because of where they lived, but because their weakened immune systems made them sitting ducks for cholera. Entire opium dens would be wiped out in a matter of days, but the real tragedy wasn't just the individual deaths. It was how the epidemic exposed the moral bankruptcy of the entire colonial system. Here was an empire that claimed to bring civilization and progress to the world, yet it was literally poisoning entire populations for profit and then abandoning them when disease struck. The opium warehouses became morgues. The streets that had once bustled with trade now reeked of death. And through it all, the East India Company kept shipping their poison to China, kept counting their profits, and kept pretending that the nightmare unfolding in Calcutta had nothing to do with them. By April of 1832, the death toll in the opium district had reached staggering numbers. Official records claimed fewer than 300 deaths, but Dr. Jameson's private notes, discovered decades later, told a very different story. He estimated that over 2,000 people had died in just the first 3 months of the outbreak, most of them in a 6-block radius around the main opium processing facilities. But the East India Company had a problem that went beyond just covering up the death count. The epidemic was starting to interfere with their supply chain, and that meant serious money was at risk. You see, the opium trade wasn't just about processing and shipping the drug. It required a massive network of local workers, transporters, and intermediaries. When cholera started killing off these essential workers, the entire operation began to wobble. Enter Thomas Wickham, a company administrator whose job it was to keep the opium flowing no matter what. Wickham was what you might call a company fixer. When problems arose that threatened profits, he made them disappear. Not through violence necessarily, though he wasn't above that when needed. Wickham's weapon of choice was bureaucratic manipulation combined with strategic bribery. When the cholera outbreak started decimating the workforce in the opium warehouses, Wickham's solution was as ingenious as it was horrifying. He couldn't stop the disease, and he couldn't improve conditions without admitting there was a problem. So instead, he decided to import fresh victims. Wickham sent recruiters into the rural areas surrounding Calcutta, promising desperate farmers steady work and good wages in the city. These recruiters painted a picture of opportunity and prosperity, carefully avoiding any mention of the disease that was ravaging the neighbourhoods where these new workers would be living. The farmers who took the bait came from villages that had been devastated by the company's forced cultivation of opium poppies. See, this is another layer of the horror that most people don't understand. The East India Company hadn't just created a market for opium addiction. They had forced Indian farmers to grow the stuff instead of food crops, creating artificial famines that drove people into the cities looking for work. So you had this perfect storm of human misery. Farmers who had been forced to grow opium instead of rice, creating food shortages in their home villages. Then, when they came to Calcutta looking for work to feed their families, they were thrown into the very warehouses where their opium was being processed, in conditions that were practically designed to spread disease. One of these recruits was a young man named Arjun Prakash. He was 19 years old and came from a village about 50 miles outside Calcutta. His family had been growing rice for generations, but the company had forced them to switch to poppies 3 years earlier. The transition had been devastating. Poppies required different soil conditions and growing techniques, and the first 2 harvests had been disasters. By 1832, Arjun's family was facing starvation. When Wickham's recruiters showed up promising steady wages and housing in Calcutta, it seemed like a miracle. Arjun left his village on a Tuesday morning in late April, carrying everything he owned in a small cloth bundle. He arrived in Calcutta that evening and was immediately taken to a boarding house, just 2 blocks from the main opium warehouse. The building had once housed a single wealthy merchant family. Now it was crammed with over 60 workers, sleeping in shifts on straw mats spread across floors that hadn't been cleaned in months. The smell hit Arjun the moment he walked through the door. It wasn't just the unwashed bodies of exhausted workers. It was something else, something sweet and cloying that seemed to stick to your clothes and hair. That was his first real encounter with processed opium, though he didn't know what it was at the time. Arjun's job was simple enough. He would receive shipments of raw opium from the countryside, weigh them, and then help transfer the material to the processing rooms, where other workers would transform it into the refined product that commanded such high prices in China. It was backbreaking work that had to be done quickly before the raw opium could spoil in Calcutta's humid climate. But Arjun quickly realized that something was very wrong with his new workplace. Workers would disappear without explanation. One day they'd be working alongside you. The next day their sleeping mat would be empty and nobody would talk about where they'd gone. The supervisors would simply bring in new recruits to replace them. What Arjun didn't know was that he had arrived just as the cholera epidemic was entering its deadliest phase. The disease had evolved beyond the initial outbreak in February and March. Now it was moving in waves, striking different neighborhoods and different populations with ruthless efficiency. The boarding house where Arjun lived was a perfect breeding ground for the disease. 60 men sharing a handful of latrines, drawing water from a well that was contaminated with runoff from the opium processing facilities. Eating food prepared in unsanitary conditions by people who were already infected but didn't know it yet. Arjun lasted exactly 11 days. He started feeling sick on a Friday morning in early May. At first, he thought it was just exhaustion from the brutal work schedule. 12 hours a day in the warehouses, breathing opium dust and chemical fumes, lifting heavy sacks in the suffocating heat. But by afternoon, the cramps started. By evening, he was doubled over with pain, vomiting everything he tried to eat or drink. The other workers in the boarding house recognized the symptoms immediately. They had seen it dozens of times before. Without saying a word, they moved Arjun's sleeping mat to a corner of the room, as far away from the others as possible. Nobody tried to help him. They couldn't afford to. Getting too close to a cholera victim was essentially a death sentence, and these men had families back home who were counting on their wages. So they watched from a distance as Arjun writhed in agony, his body betraying him in the most brutal ways imaginable. He died on Sunday morning, just as the first shipment of the week was arriving from the poppy fields. His body was wrapped in a dirty sheet and thrown onto a cart with 3 other victims from the boarding house. By Monday, his sleeping mat was occupied by a new recruit who had no idea what had happened to his predecessor. This was the reality of the opium trade that the East India Company tried so hard to hide. It wasn't just about addiction or moral corruption. It was about a systematic program of human sacrifice, where Indian lives were literally expendable resources in the pursuit of profit. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The cholera epidemic wasn't just killing individual workers like Arjun. It was creating a feedback loop that made the entire situation worse. As workers died, the company needed to bring in more replacements. These new workers, desperate and uninformed, were willing to accept even worse conditions for the same wages. Wickham saw this as an opportunity. Why pay decent wages when people were literally dying for the chance to work in your warehouses? He systematically reduced wages, eliminated what few safety measures existed, and packed even more workers into the same cramped spaces. The result was predictable. Cholera spread faster and killed more efficiently. But from the company's perspective, this was actually beneficial. High worker turnover meant they never had to deal with organized labor demands or pay long-term benefits. Dead workers didn't form unions or demand better conditions. Dr. Jameson's replacement, a company physician named Dr. Harold Stevens, understood his role perfectly. When workers got sick, he didn't treat them. He simply documented their deaths and certified that they had died of natural causes, rather than anything that might implicate the company in negligence. Stevens kept meticulous records, not out of medical concern, but to protect the company from potential legal liability. His death certificates blamed everything except the actual cause. Workers died of moral weakness, constitutional deficiency, or climatic unsuitability. Never cholera, and certainly never anything that might be traced back to the conditions in the opium warehouses. Meanwhile, the profits kept flowing. Even with the disruption caused by the epidemic, the East India Company was making more money from opium than ever before. The Chinese market was expanding rapidly, and the British had discovered that addiction was the most reliable customer base in the world. Once someone was hooked on opium, they would pay any price to get it. The ships leaving Calcutta's harbour were loaded with more than just processed opium. They carried the concentrated suffering of thousands of people like Arjun, Ramesh, and Kamala. Every pound of opium represented hours of forced labour, exposure to deadly chemicals, and life in conditions that were barely fit for animals. But the most insidious part of the whole operation was how it had corrupted everyone involved. British merchants who had come to India as young men, with some semblance of moral principles, found themselves managing a trade that required them to treat human beings as disposable commodities. Indian administrators and clerks, who had hoped to improve conditions for their people, discovered that survival meant complicity in their oppression. Even the addicts themselves became part of the machine. Desperate for their next fix, they would do anything to earn the money needed to buy opium. Some became recruiters, luring friends and family members into the same trap that had claimed them. Others became informants, reporting on workers who showed signs of organizing or resistance. The cholera epidemic exposed all of this moral rot, but it also revealed something else. It showed just how fragile the entire system really was. For all their wealth and power, the British had built their empire on a foundation that could be toppled by something as simple as contaminated water. The disease didn't respect social hierarchies or racial categories. It killed British sailors just as efficiently as Indian labourers. It spread through the marble mansions of European merchants just as quickly as through the slums of the opium district. though the company worked much harder to contain it in the areas where white people lived. This created a constant state of paranoia among the British community in Calcutta. They knew that their wealth and privilege depended on maintaining conditions that were literally breeding grounds for epidemic disease. They also knew that no amount of money could completely insulate them from the consequences of their actions. Some British merchants tried to ease their consciences through charitable donations or small improvements to working conditions, but these gestures were meaningless compared to the scale of the problem they had created. You can't fix systematic oppression with occasional acts of kindness, especially when those acts are funded by the same trade that's causing the oppression in the first place. The cholera epidemic of 1832 would eventually burn itself out, but not before claiming an estimated 10,000 lives in Calcutta alone. The East India Company's official records acknowledged fewer than 800 deaths, a number so absurdly low that even some company officials privately questioned its accuracy. But the real tragedy wasn't just the death toll, it was how quickly everyone moved on, how easily the lessons were forgotten. Within months of the epidemic's end, the opium warehouses were back to full production. New workers were recruited to replace the dead ones. The same unsanitary conditions that had made the outbreak possible were restored, because fixing them would cost money. Dr. Stevens wasn't just complicit in covering up the deaths, he was actively profiting from them. You see, when workers died in the opium warehouses, their personal belongings were supposed to be sent back to their families. Instead, Stevens had worked out a deal with Wickham where these possessions would be sold to incoming workers at inflated prices. A dead man's blanket that had cost his family 2 rupees would be sold to the next desperate recruit for 5. Tools, cooking pots, even the cloth bundles that held their few personal items, everything became part of this ghoulish economy built on human misery. But Stevens had discovered something even more profitable than selling dead men's belongings. He had started harvesting their bodies for medical experiments that he claimed were necessary to understand the cholera epidemic. In reality, these experiments were funded by British pharmaceutical companies who wanted to understand how opium affected the human body under extreme stress. Think about the moral depravity required for this. Stevens would watch men die in agony from cholera, then immediately cut open their bodies to study how opium had damaged their organs. He kept detailed notes on how long-term opium exposure affected resistance to disease, how different doses influenced recovery rates, and how malnutrition interacted with both opium addiction and cholera infection. These weren't legitimate medical studies designed to help future patients. They were market research for drug dealers who wanted to maximize addiction while minimizing the death rate among their customers. The East India Company needed addicts who would live long enough to generate sustained profits, not customers who would die too quickly. Stevens's reports were shipped back to London along with the processed opium, where they informed company policies about dosage recommendations and quality control. The British had turned human suffering into a science, complete with charts, graphs, and statistical analysis. One of Stevens's most disturbing discoveries was that workers who had been exposed to opium dust in the warehouses actually had slightly higher survival rates when they contracted cholera. Not because the opium helped them fight the disease, but because their bodies had developed a tolerance that kept them functional longer during the early stages of infection. This finding led to a horrific policy change. Wickham began deliberately exposing new workers to opium dust during their first weeks on the job, claiming it was necessary job training. In reality, he was trying to create a workforce that could continue laboring even while infected with cholera. The results were predictable and nightmarish. Workers would continue processing opium while suffering from the early symptoms of cholera, spreading the disease more efficiently throughout the warehouses. By the time they became too sick to work, they had already infected dozens of their colleagues. But from the company's perspective, this was brilliant management. Instead of losing entire work crews to sudden outbreaks, They could maintain production levels even during epidemic conditions. The opium kept flowing, the ships kept sailing, and the profits kept growing, even as the death toll mounted. Let me tell you about Priya Sharma, a widow who came to Calcutta in June of 1832 with her 8-year-old daughter Meera. Priya's husband had been killed in a farming accident, and the company's forced poppy cultivation had left her with no way to support herself and her child in their village. When Wickham's recruiters promised her work in a textile factory with housing and schooling for Meera, it seemed like salvation. What they didn't mention was that the so-called textile factory was actually a front operation where women processed raw opium into the refined paste that commanded higher prices in the Chinese market. The work involved boiling raw opium in large vats, then stirring the mixture with wooden paddles for hours at a time. The women worked in shifts around the clock, breathing toxic fumes that left them dizzy and nauseous. Many developed chronic coughs that never went away. Others suffered burns from splashing opium paste that had been heated to dangerous temperatures. Priya lasted 3 weeks before the cholera got her, but during those 3 weeks, she witnessed something that would haunt anyone with a functioning conscience. The company was using children as young as 6 or 7 to perform the most dangerous parts of the opium processing. These children were small enough to crawl inside the vats to scrape out residue that would otherwise be wasted. They would spend hours in confined spaces filled with opium fumes, emerging pale and disoriented, often unable to walk straight. Many developed what the supervisors called the shakes, violent tremors that made it impossible for them to perform even simple tasks. When Priya tried to object, pointing out that her own daughter was being forced to work in these conditions, she was told that children who didn't work didn't eat. It was that simple. The company provided minimal food rations, but only to workers who met their daily quotas. Anyone who couldn't or wouldn't work faced starvation. This created a horrific dynamic where parents were forced to watch their children being poisoned, while knowing that any attempt to protect them would result in the entire family being thrown out onto the streets. Calcutta's streets, remember, were already littered with cholera victims and crawling with disease. Meera was one of the children assigned to vat cleaning duty. At 8 years old, she weighed barely 40 pounds and could squeeze into spaces that older children couldn't reach. Every day she would climb into vats that were still warm from the previous batch of processed opium, scraping the sides with metal tools that left her hands bloody and raw. The opium residue got into every cut, every scrape, every open wound. Within days of starting this work, Meera was showing signs of opium poisoning. She would fall asleep standing up, lose track of conversations mid-sentence, and sometimes forget where she was or what she was supposed to be doing. Priya watched helplessly as her daughter was slowly destroyed by the very substance that was supposed to provide their salvation. She tried to get medical help, but Dr. Stevens informed her that treatment was only available to workers who could pay for it in advance. Since Priya's wages barely covered their food and housing, medical care was impossible. When Priya finally succumbed to cholera, Meera was left completely alone in a city that had no use for orphan children except as expendable labor. The company's policy was clear. Orphans could continue working until they died or became too sick to function, at which point they would be discarded like any other piece of broken equipment. Meera survived another 2 months before cholera claimed her too. She died on a Tuesday morning in late August, curled up in a corner of the processing room where she had spent her final weeks scraping opium residue from metal vats. She was buried in an unmarked grave along with dozens of other workers who had died that week. Her death was recorded in Dr. Stevens' ledger as Orphan number 47, cause of death, constitutional weakness. No mention of her name, her age, or the conditions that had killed her. She had been reduced to a statistic in a company report that would never be seen by anyone who might have cared about her fate. This was the reality behind the East India Company's opium empire. It wasn't just built on addiction and exploitation. It was built on the systematic murder of children, the deliberate creation of conditions designed to maximize death and suffering among the most vulnerable populations. But the company had a problem that went beyond just managing their workforce of dying addicts and poisoned children. The cholera epidemic was starting to spread beyond Calcutta, following the same trade routes that carried their opium to markets across Asia. Ships leaving Calcutta's harbour weren't just carrying processed opium. They were carrying cholera-infected crew members who would spread the disease to every port they visited. Within months, the epidemic had reached Bombay, Madras, and dozens of smaller trading posts throughout the British Empire. This created a nightmare scenario for colonial administrators. They couldn't quarantine Calcutta without shutting down the opium trade, but they couldn't allow the epidemic to spread without risking the collapse of their entire economic system. The solution they chose reveals everything you need to know about their priorities. Instead of addressing the root causes of the epidemic, they decided to blame the victims. Official reports began describing cholera as a disease that specifically targeted people with moral weaknesses and degraded lifestyles. The clear implication was that opium addicts and warehouse workers were dying because of their own character flaws, not because of the conditions the company had created. This narrative served multiple purposes. It deflected blame away from the company, it justified the lack of medical care for affected populations, and it provided a moral framework that allowed British officials to continue profiting from human misery without feeling guilty about it. Dr. William Morrison was a British physician who arrived in Calcutta in September of 1832, just as the epidemic was reaching its peak intensity. Unlike Dr. Stevens, Morrison had been sent by the Royal College of Physicians in London to conduct an independent investigation of the outbreak. Morrison's assignment was supposed to be straightforward: document the spread of cholera, identify its causes, and recommend public health measures to prevent future epidemics. What he discovered instead was a conspiracy of silence that reached the highest levels of colonial government. His first indication that something was wrong came when he tried to access medical records from the Opium District. Dr. Stevens informed him that these records were classified as commercial secrets and couldn't be shared without authorization from company headquarters in London. When Morrison pointed out that he was investigating a public health emergency, Stevens simply shrugged and said that company policy was company policy. Morrison's requests for authorization were buried in bureaucratic delays that stretched on for weeks. Meanwhile, people were dying at a rate that shocked even a physician who had served in military hospitals during wartime. He estimated that the actual death toll was at least 10 times higher than the official figures being reported to London. Unable to access official records, Morrison began conducting his own investigation. He interviewed survivors, examined conditions in the warehouses and boarding houses, and traced the patterns of disease transmission throughout the city. What he found was a systematic program of negligent homicide that had been disguised as legitimate commerce. The opium warehouses weren't just unsanitary. They had been deliberately designed to maximize profits at the expense of human life. Ventilation systems that could have reduced exposure to toxic fumes had been eliminated to save money. Drainage systems that could have prevented the spread of waterborne diseases had never been installed because they would have required shutting down operations temporarily. Even more damning, Morrison discovered that company officials had known about the health risks for years. Internal memos dating back to 1828 discussed the acceptable casualty rates among warehouse workers and calculated the cost-benefit ratio of various safety measures. One memo, written by Thomas Wickham himself, included this chilling observation. The mortality rate among native workers, while regrettable, does not significantly impact profitability provided recruitment can be maintained at current levels. Indeed, high turnover may be beneficial in preventing the formation of organized labor demands. Morrison realized he was documenting more than just an epidemic. he was uncovering evidence of what would today be called crimes against humanity, committed on an industrial scale by one of the most powerful corporations in the world. But when Morrison tried to publish his findings, he ran into a wall of official resistance that extended far beyond the East India Company. The colonial government, the British military, and even the Church of England had financial interests in the opium trade that made them unwilling to support any investigation that might threaten those profits. Morrison's reports were classified, his funding was cut, and he was informed that his services were no longer needed in India. Like Dr. Jameson before him, he found himself transferred to a remote posting where his inconvenient discoveries could be safely forgotten. But Morrison had managed to smuggle copies of some documents back to London, where they eventually reached sympathetic members of Parliament who were already beginning to question the morality of the opium trade. These documents would later become crucial evidence in the parliamentary debates that eventually led to some reforms in colonial policy. However, those reforms wouldn't come for decades, and they wouldn't help the thousands of people who were dying in Calcutta while politicians in London debated the finer points of imperial ethics. The immediate impact of Morrison's investigation was essentially zero. The warehouses kept operating, the workers kept dying, and the opium kept flowing to China, where it would create millions of additional addicts and eventually trigger wars that would reshape the entire global balance of power. By October of 1832, the cholera epidemic in Calcutta had killed an estimated 12,000 people, though the official death toll remained frozen at under 900. The disease had spread throughout the British Empire and beyond, eventually reaching Europe and the Americas, where it would claim hundreds of thousands of additional lives. But in Calcutta, life went on much as it had before. New workers were recruited to replace the dead ones. The same unsanitary conditions that had enabled the epidemic were restored, because fixing them would cost money. The same officials who had covered up the outbreak were promoted to positions of greater authority. The East India Company had learned an important lesson from the cholera epidemic, but it wasn't the lesson that any decent human being would hope for. They had learned that they could literally kill thousands of people and face no meaningful consequences as long as the profits continued flowing and the right officials were properly bribed. This lesson would inform company policy for decades to come, contributing to famines, rebellions, and countless smaller atrocities that rarely made it into the official historical record. The cholera epidemic of 1832 wasn't an aberration or an accident. It was a preview of the systematic brutality that would define British colonial rule for the next century. And through it all, the opium ships kept sailing from Calcutta's harbour, carrying their cargo of concentrated human suffering to markets across Asia. Each shipment represented not just addiction and moral corruption, but the deliberate sacrifice of human lives for commercial profit. The sweet, cloying smell of processed opium had become the smell of death itself, wafting through the humid air of colonial Calcutta like incense at a funeral that would never end. The ships that left Calcutta in the autumn of 1832 carried more than just opium and cholera. They carried stories that would echo across the empire for generations. Stories of men like Captain Robert Blackwood, a former naval officer who had traded his commission for a merchant's license and a chance at the kind of wealth that opium could provide. Blackwood had arrived in Calcutta 5 years earlier, fresh from the Napoleonic Wars, with a head full of romantic notions about colonial adventure. What he found instead was a business opportunity so lucrative, it made piracy look like honest work. By 1832, he owned 3 ships that ran regular routes between Calcutta and Canton, carrying processed opium to Chinese markets that seemed to have an insatiable appetite for the drug. But Blackwood's ships weren't just cargo vessels. They were floating laboratories where he conducted his own experiments in human misery. See, Blackwood had discovered that opium addicts made ideal sailors for certain kinds of voyages. They were desperate enough to work for minimal wages, compliant enough to follow orders without question, and expendable enough that losing a few to disease or accident didn't significantly impact operations. His flagship, the Prosperity, carried a crew of 43 men, 31 of whom were opium addicts, recruited from the warehouses of Calcutta. These weren't voluntary crew members in any meaningful sense. They were indentured servants who had traded their addiction for passage to Chinese ports where they could feed their habits while serving Blackwood's commercial interests. The conditions aboard the Prosperity were deliberately designed to maintain the crew's dependence while maximizing their usefulness. Blackwood controlled the opium supply, doling out just enough to keep his men functional but never enough to satisfy their cravings. This created a crew that was utterly dependent on his goodwill and completely willing to take risks that no sober sailor would consider. When cholera broke out in Calcutta, Blackwood saw it as a business opportunity rather than a humanitarian crisis. Infected crew members could be replaced cheaply from the growing population of desperate addicts. Ships could be loaded and unloaded more quickly because dying workers would accept any conditions rather than risk losing their jobs. But Blackwood made a crucial miscalculation. He assumed that cholera would remain confined to the lower classes, the addicts and warehouse workers who were already considered expendable. He didn't understand that diseases don't respect social hierarchies, especially in the confined quarters of a ship, where contaminated water and poor sanitation create perfect conditions for epidemic spread. The Prosperity left Calcutta on October 15th, 1832, with a full cargo of processed opium and a crew that included at least 6 men showing early symptoms of cholera. Blackwood knew about the infected crew members, but decided that delaying departure would cost more money than losing a few sailors along the way. 3 days into the voyage, the first crew member died. His name was Marcus Webb, a former soldier who had developed an opium habit after being wounded in Burma. Webb had been working in the Calcutta warehouses for 8 months, saving money to bring his wife and children over from England. He died alone in the ship's hold, vomiting blood while his fellow crew members watched from a safe distance. Blackwood ordered Webb's body thrown overboard without ceremony, then increased the opium rations for the remaining crew to keep them working despite their fear. This decision would prove catastrophic. The increased opium doses weakened the men's immune systems just as cholera was spreading throughout the ship. By the end of the first week, 12 crew members were dead and another 8 were showing symptoms. The Prosperity was still 5 days away from its first scheduled stop in Madras, but Blackwood faced a dilemma. If he put into port with a cholera-infected ship, he would face quarantine procedures that could delay his cargo for weeks. If he continued on course, he risked losing his entire crew before reaching Canton. Blackwood chose a third option that reveals the depth of his moral corruption. He decided to dump the sickest crew members at uninhabited islands along the coast, essentially marooning them to die while preserving his healthy sailors for the remainder of the voyage. The first group of abandoned men included Thomas Crawford, a Scottish clerk who had been working in the opium warehouses to pay off gambling debts. Crawford was dumped on a small island near the Andaman chain with 3 other infected sailors, given a week's worth of water and told that rescue ships would return for them once the epidemic had passed. No rescue ships ever came. Crawford and his companions died within days, their bodies eventually discovered by British naval patrols, who were investigating reports of pirate activity in the area. The official report described them as victims of shipwreck, making no mention of deliberate abandonment or cholera infection. Blackwood repeated this process 3 more times during the voyage to Canton, each time selecting the sickest crew members for abandonment, while keeping just enough healthy sailors to operate the ship. By the time the Prosperity reached Chinese waters, 26 of the original 43 crew members were dead, abandoned, or too sick to work. But here's the truly horrifying part. Blackwood's voyage was considered a commercial success by East India Company standards. Despite losing more than half his crew, he had delivered his opium cargo on schedule and generated profits that more than compensated for the cost of replacing dead sailors. the company's accounting methods didn't factor in human lives as a meaningful expense. The success of Blackwood's voyage established a template that other merchants would follow throughout the 1830s. Ships carrying opium from Calcutta became notorious for their high mortality rates. But this reputation actually helped recruitment among addicts, who saw maritime service as their only escape from the warehouses. What these desperate men didn't understand was that they were trading one form of slow death for another. The ships offered the illusion of freedom, while actually providing an even more controlled environment for exploitation. At sea, there was nowhere to run, no possibility of finding alternative employment, and no legal recourse against captains who treated their crews as expendable cargo. Captain Sarah Mitchell was one of the few merchants who tried to operate differently. Mitchell was unusual for several reasons, not least because she was a woman commanding her own vessel in an era when such things were almost unheard of. She had inherited her ship, the Redemption, from her husband, who had died of fever during their second voyage to China. Mitchell's approach to the opium trade was shaped by her personal experience with addiction. Her husband had become dependent on opium during his final illness, and she had watched him deteriorate from a capable sea captain into a desperate addict who would do anything for his next dose. This experience gave her insights into the psychology of addiction that most merchants lacked. Instead of exploiting her crew's dependence, Mitchell tried to help them overcome it. She instituted gradual withdrawal programs, provided better food and medical care, and shared profits with crew members who remained clean for entire voyages. Her ship became known as a place where addicts could attempt recovery while still earning the wages needed to support their families. Mitchell's humane approach was initially successful. Her crew mortality rates were significantly lower than industry standards, and her ships completed voyages faster because healthy sailors worked more efficiently than addicted ones. Several former addicts who served on her vessels were able to return to normal lives in England or establish themselves as independent merchants in Asian ports. But Mitchell's success threatened the business model that other merchants depended on. If word spread that opium addiction could be treated successfully, the entire system of indentured labor that powered the trade would collapse. Merchants like Blackwood depended on having access to desperate addicts who would work for minimal wages under horrific conditions. The response was swift and coordinated. Mitchell found herself excluded from the informal networks that controlled access to the best opium supplies. Her ships were subjected to unusual scrutiny by port authorities who discovered mysterious violations of regulations that had never been enforced against other vessels. Her crew members were offered better deals by competing merchants who could afford to outbid her because they didn't spend money on medical care or decent food. Within 2 years, Mitchell was forced out of the opium trade entirely. She tried to transition to legitimate cargo hauling, but the same network of merchants and officials that had driven her out of the drug trade also controlled most other commercial opportunities in the region. She eventually sold the Redemption and returned to England, where she spent the rest of her life writing letters to Parliament, describing the horrors she had witnessed in the opium trade. Mitchell's letters provide some of the most detailed first-hand accounts of conditions aboard opium ships during this period. She described crew members dying in agony while captains calculated whether the cost of medical treatment exceeded the expense of replacement sailors. She documented cases where sick crew members were sold to other ships like pieces of equipment, with no regard for their consent or well-being. One of Mitchell's most disturbing accounts involved a young man named David Chen, a mixed-race sailor whose Chinese mother had been forced into prostitution in Canton's foreign quarter, while his British father had abandoned them both to return to England. Chen had turned to opium as a teenager, working on various merchant ships to fund his addiction, while dreaming of someday earning enough money to rescue his mother from her circumstances. Chen served on Mitchell's ship during her final year in the trade, and she watched him struggle to overcome his dependence while dealing with the racial discrimination that made it almost impossible for mixed-race sailors to find legitimate employment. Even when Chen managed to stay clean for months at a time, Other merchants refused to hire him because of his ancestry. This racial dimension of the opium trade is something that most historical accounts gloss over, but it was central to how the system operated. British merchants needed Chinese contacts to navigate the complex commercial and political networks in Canton, but they also needed to maintain clear hierarchies that kept Chinese and mixed-race individuals in subordinate positions. The result was a class of people like David Chen who were essential to the trade, but could never benefit from it in any meaningful way. They served as translators, local guides, and intermediaries. But they were also scapegoats who could be blamed when things went wrong and abandoned when they were no longer useful. Chen's story ended tragically, though not in the way you might expect. He successfully overcame his opium addiction while serving on Mitchell's ship and seemed to be building a stable life for himself. But when Mitchell was forced out of the trade, Chen found himself unemployable in the legitimate merchant fleet because of his race, and unwelcome in the opium trade because of his recovery. Desperate and facing starvation, Chen eventually returned to opium use and signed on with a merchant who promised him regular wages and a chance to work his way up to a position of responsibility. The merchant was lying, of course. Chen was used as expendable labor on increasingly dangerous voyages until he finally died of fever and exhaustion somewhere in the South China Sea. His death illustrates how the opium trade didn't just destroy individuals, it destroyed entire categories of people who might have contributed to legitimate commerce if they hadn't been trapped in a system designed to exploit their vulnerabilities while offering no real path to improvement. The psychological impact of this systematic dehumanization extended far beyond the direct victims. British merchants who had started their careers with some semblance of moral principles found themselves gradually corrupted by a trade that required them to view human beings as disposable resources. Take the case of Edmund Hartwell, a young merchant who arrived in Calcutta in 1831 with plans to make his fortune in the spice trade. Hartwell came from a middle-class family in Yorkshire, had received a decent education, and considered himself a moral person who would never engage in anything disreputable. But the spice trade was already controlled by established merchants who weren't interested in sharing their profits with newcomers. The only real opportunity for someone like Hartwell was in opium, where the enormous profits and rapid expansion created constant demand for new participants. Hartwell told himself that he was only entering the opium trade temporarily, just long enough to accumulate the capital needed to establish himself in more legitimate commerce. He would maintain high moral standards, treat his workers fairly, and get out as soon as possible. This rationalization lasted exactly 3 months. The first compromise came when Hartwell discovered that treating workers fairly put him at a competitive disadvantage compared to merchants who were willing to exploit their employees more ruthlessly. If he wanted to survive in the business, he would have to adopt the same practices as his competitors. The second compromise came when Hartwell realized that the workers themselves expected to be exploited. Men who had been brutalized by other merchants were suspicious of anyone who offered them better treatment, assuming it was some kind of trap. Hartwell found it easier to meet their expectations than to convince them that he was different. The third compromise was the most insidious. Hartwell discovered that he was good at the opium trade, better than he had ever been at anything else in his life. The combination of commercial complexity, physical danger, and enormous potential profits created a kind of excitement that legitimate business could never match. Within a year, Hartwell was operating 3 warehouses and employing over 200 workers under conditions that he would have found morally reprehensible when he first arrived in India. He had adopted the same cost-cutting measures, the same disregard for worker safety, and the same casual attitude toward human suffering that characterized the entire industry. But Hartwell had also developed something else that was common among opium merchants: an elaborate system of justifications that allowed him to maintain his self-image as a decent person while engaging in systematically indecent behavior. He convinced himself that he was actually helping his workers by providing them with employment opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise. He argued that the harsh working conditions were necessary to prepare them for the realities of life in a competitive economy. He claimed that high mortality rates were inevitable consequences of the climate and local diseases, not results of the conditions he had created. Most importantly, Hartwell developed the ability to compartmentalize his life in ways that allowed him to separate his business activities from his personal relationships. He could spend his days managing operations that killed dozens of workers every month, then return home to write loving letters to his family in Yorkshire, describing his efforts to bring civilization and progress to India. This psychological compartmentalization was essential to the functioning of the entire opium system. Without it, the cognitive dissonance between merchants' self-image and their actual behavior would have been unbearable. By creating elaborate justifications and mental barriers, they could maintain their participation in a system that they knew was fundamentally evil. The cholera epidemic of 1832 tested these psychological defenses in ways that many merchants found difficult to handle. When faced with mass death on a scale that couldn't be ignored or rationalized away, some merchants experienced complete mental breakdowns that left them unable to function. Others, like Hartwell, doubled down on their justifications and became even more ruthless in their pursuit of profits. If cholera was going to kill workers anyway, why not extract maximum value from them before they died? If the epidemic was exposing the system's moral bankruptcy, why not abandon any pretense of decency and focus entirely on commercial success? This psychological hardening had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate victims of the opium trade. The merchants who survived and prospered during the cholera epidemic became the leaders of British commercial society in India, establishing precedents and cultural norms that would influence colonial policy for decades. They created a business culture where human suffering was treated as an acceptable cost of doing business, where racial hierarchies were justified as natural law, and where enormous wealth could be accumulated without any corresponding social responsibility. This culture would shape not just the opium trade, but every aspect of British colonial rule in Asia. The ships that carried these merchants and their cargo between Calcutta and Canton became floating laboratories for testing the limits of human endurance and the boundaries of moral, acceptable behavior. Each voyage was an experiment in how much suffering could be inflicted while still maintaining profitable operations. The results of these experiments were carefully documented and shared among merchants who were constantly looking for ways to improve their efficiency. Letters and reports from this period read like instruction manuals for systematic cruelty, complete with cost-benefit analyses of different approaches to worker exploitation. But the most chilling aspect of these documents is their tone. The merchants who wrote them weren't sadistic monsters who enjoyed causing pain. They were businessmen who had learned to treat human suffering as a technical problem that required practical solutions. They wrote about mortality rates the way other merchants might discuss inventory shrinkage. They analyzed the relationship between working conditions and productivity with the same detached professionalism that modern corporations use to study market trends. They had transformed evil into a science, complete with methodologies, best practices, and performance metrics. This bureaucratization of cruelty made the opium trade far more devastating than it would have been if it had been run by simple criminals. Criminals operate on a small scale and eventually face consequences for their actions. But when evil becomes institutionalized, when it's supported by legal frameworks and social norms, when it's justified by economic theories and moral philosophies, it can operate indefinitely without meaningful opposition. The East India Company had created exactly this kind of institutionalized evil in their opium operations. They had transformed what could have been a relatively small-scale criminal enterprise into a systematic program of exploitation that affected millions of people across multiple continents. The cholera epidemic of 1832 revealed the true scope of this system by following the same networks that carried opium from Indian poppy fields to Chinese opium dens. Every port, every trading post, every commercial hub that participated in the opium trade also became a vector for epidemic disease. By early 1833, cholera had spread throughout the British Empire and beyond, reaching Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The disease followed trade routes like a detective following clues, exposing the hidden connections that linked seemingly separate commercial operations into a single global system of exploitation. But even as cholera was killing thousands of people and disrupting commerce across multiple continents, the fundamental structure of the opium trade remained unchanged. The same merchants continued operating from the same warehouses under the same conditions that had enabled the epidemic in the first place. The reason was simple. The profits were too enormous and the political protection too comprehensive for anything short of total systemic collapse to threaten the trade's continuation. Individual merchants might die of cholera, specific warehouses might be temporarily shut down, particular ships might be lost to disease, but the overall system was robust enough to absorb these losses without fundamental change. This resilience wasn't accidental. The East India Company had designed their opium operations to be anti-fragile, meaning they actually became stronger when subjected to stress. High mortality rates among workers meant there was always pressure to improve recruitment methods. Epidemic diseases created opportunities to acquire property and resources from desperate sellers. Political instability opened new markets and eliminated competing suppliers. The company had created a machine that literally fed on human misery, converting suffering into profit with industrial efficiency. The cholera epidemic wasn't a crisis for this machine. It was fuel that made it run faster and more effectively than ever before, and at the center of it all was Calcutta, the beating heart of an empire built on poison and sustained by death. The city had become something unprecedented in human history. An urban center whose primary function was the systematic destruction of human life for commercial purposes. The sweet smell of processed opium that permeated the city wasn't just the scent of a drug. It was the smell of an entire civilization's moral collapse, concentrated into a few square miles of warehouses, boarding houses, and shipping facilities where the worst impulses of human nature had been refined into a business model. But the story doesn't end there. Because while the merchants and officials were counting their profits and covering up their crimes, other forces were beginning to stir. Forces that would eventually challenge not just the opium trade, but the entire system of exploitation that had made it possible. The cholera epidemic had done more than kill thousands of people. It had created thousands of witnesses, survivors who had seen the true face of British colonial rule and lived to tell others about it. These witnesses would become the foundation of resistance movements that would eventually threaten the very existence of the empire that opium had built. The resistance began not with grand speeches or political manifestos, but with whispered conversations in the narrow alleyways between opium warehouses. Men like Rajesh Kumar, a former clerk who had watched his entire family die during the cholera outbreak, found themselves asking dangerous questions. Why had the disease struck so mercilessly in their neighborhoods while sparing the British quarters? Why had medical care been denied to Indian workers while European merchants received immediate treatment? Why had the very people who profited from their labor abandoned them to die like animals in the street? Kumar had worked for the East India Company for 7 years, keeping meticulous records of opium shipments and worker assignments. He had believed, like so many others, that loyalty and hard work would eventually be rewarded with better opportunities for himself and his family. The cholera epidemic had shattered those illusions with the brutal efficiency of a sledgehammer. When the disease struck his household in March of 1833, Kumar had done everything the company's medical guidelines recommended. He had reported the symptoms immediately, requested medical assistance through proper channels, and even offered to pay for treatment from his own savings. The response had been a form letter informing him that medical resources were being reserved for essential personnel, a category that apparently didn't include clerks who had devoted their careers to company service. Kumar's wife, Sunita, died first, followed by their 2 young sons within the span of a week. He was forced to burn their bodies himself because the company's burial services were also restricted to essential personnel. As he watched his family's remains turn to ash on a makeshift pyre behind the warehouse where he had worked for 7 years, something fundamental shifted in Kumar's understanding of his place in the colonial order. The man who emerged from that experience was no longer the compliant clerk who had once taken pride in his English language skills and his ability to navigate company bureaucracy. This new version of Rajesh Kumar was someone who had seen the true face of British rule and found it utterly devoid of the civilizing mission it claimed to represent. Kumar began using his position within the company to document the systematic nature of the neglect that had killed his family. He copied internal memos, recorded conversations between British officials, and compiled statistics that revealed the stark disparities in how cholera victims were treated based on their race and social status. What Kumar discovered was even worse than he had imagined. The company hadn't simply neglected Indian workers during the epidemic. They had actively prevented them from seeking medical care elsewhere, arguing that allowing workers to leave their posts would disrupt opium production schedules. Internal documents revealed that company officials had calculated the optimal death rate that would remove excess workers without significantly impacting productivity. One memo, written by Thomas Wickham and discovered by Kumar in February of 1833, contained this chilling assessment. The current mortality rate of approximately 15% per quarter provides an acceptable balance between labour costs and operational efficiency. Higher rates would require increased recruitment expenses, while lower rates would result in wage inflation due to worker scarcity. Kumar realised he was looking at evidence of premeditated murder on an industrial scale. The East India Company hadn't just failed to protect their workers from cholera, they had deliberately created conditions designed to maintain what they considered an optimal death rate among the Indian labour force. But Kumar also knew that possessing this evidence meant nothing if he couldn't find a way to use it effectively. Individual acts of rebellion would be crushed immediately, and any attempt to organise open resistance would be met with overwhelming force. The company had military backing, legal immunity, and the resources to eliminate any threat to their operations. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. William Morrison, the British physician who had been transferred out of Calcutta for asking too many questions about the cholera epidemic, had managed to maintain contact with sympathetic Indians who shared his concerns about company policies. Morrison had spent his exile documenting conditions throughout the British Colonial far beyond the opium trade. His system, gathering evidence of systematic abuses that Extend had discovered that the patterns he observed in Calcutta were being replicated across India, creating a network of exploitation that touched virtually every aspect of colonial society. Through intermediaries, Morrison made contact with Kumar and several other Indian clerks and administrators who had access to company records. Together, they began assembling a comprehensive dossier of evidence that documented not just the cholera cover-up, but the entire structure of institutionalized brutality that sustained British rule in India. This clandestine network included people like Kamala Devi, a widow who had lost her husband and 3 children during the epidemic, and now worked as a seamstress in one of the textile operations that served as a front for opium processing. Devi had intimate knowledge of how the company exploited Indian women and children, forcing them to work in dangerous conditions while denying them the legal protections that were theoretically available to all British subjects. Devi's particular expertise was in documenting the sexual exploitation that was endemic throughout the company's operations. British merchants and administrators routinely coerced Indian women into providing sexual services in exchange for jobs, medical care, or protection from arbitrary punishment. Women who refused these demands found themselves dismissed, evicted, or worse. The evidence Devi compiled revealed that sexual exploitation wasn't just tolerated by company officials. It was institutionalized through policies that gave British men virtually unlimited power over Indian women, while providing no meaningful recourse for victims of abuse. One case Devi documented involved a 15-year-old girl named Meera Patel, who had been forced into prostitution to pay for her mother's medical treatment during the cholera epidemic. When Patel tried to escape this arrangement, she was charged with theft of company property and sentenced to 2 years of indentured labour in the opium warehouses. Patel's story was horrifying enough on its own, but Devi discovered that it was part of a systematic pattern. Company officials were deliberately using medical crises and economic desperation to coerce Indian women into sexual slavery, then using the legal system to punish anyone who tried to resist or escape. The network also included men like Arun Bhattacharya, a former soldier who had served with distinction in company military units before being discharged without pension, when he questioned orders to suppress worker protests in the opium districts. Bhattacharya brought military expertise to the resistance network, along with contacts among Indian soldiers, who were becoming increasingly disillusioned with their British officers. Bhattacharya had witnessed firsthand how company military forces were used to enforce labour discipline in the opium warehouses. He had participated in raids that rounded up workers who tried to organise for better conditions, watched as protesters were beaten unconscious by his fellow soldiers, and helped implement collective punishment policies that starved entire neighbourhoods when individual workers failed to meet production quotas. The breaking point for Bhattacharya had come during the cholera epidemic, when he was ordered to prevent Indian workers from leaving the warehouse district to seek medical care. His commanding officer, Captain James Fletcher, had explained that allowing workers to disperse would make it impossible to maintain production schedules and could spread panic among the European population. Bhattacharya had followed orders, establishing checkpoints that trapped thousands of people in the most disease-ridden areas of the city. He had watched families die because they couldn't reach medical facilities that were less than a mile away. He had seen children succumb to cholera while their parents begged him to let them pass through military cordons that served no purpose except to protect company profits. When Bhattacharya finally refused to continue participating in what he recognized as systematic murder, Captain Fletcher had him arrested for insubordination and mutiny. The court-martial that followed was a sham proceeding designed to make an example of any soldier who might consider placing human decency above commercial interests. Bhattacharya was stripped of his rank, his pension, and his legal status as a British subject. He was released into a society where his military service meant nothing, and his act of conscience had made him unemployable in any company-controlled enterprise. Like so many other Indians who had served the empire faithfully only to be discarded when they became inconvenient, Bhattacharya found himself with nothing left to lose. The resistance network that formed around these individuals was unlike anything the British had faced before in India. Previous rebellions had been based on traditional political or religious grievances that could be addressed through negotiation or suppressed through military force. This new resistance was based on a fundamental understanding of how the colonial system actually operated, complete with documentary evidence and insider knowledge that made it impossible to dismiss or deflect. Kumar, Devi, Bhattacharya, and their associates weren't demanding reforms or better treatment. They were exposing the entire structure of British rule as a criminal enterprise that had no legitimate basis for existence. Their goal wasn't to negotiate with the system, but to destroy it entirely by revealing its true nature to the world. The network's first major operation was the compilation of what they called the Calcutta Papers, a comprehensive collection of documents that revealed the scope of company crimes during the cholera epidemic and beyond. These papers included internal memos discussing optimal death rates among workers, medical records that had been falsified to hide the true extent of the epidemic, financial documents showing how cholera victims' possessions had been sold for profit, and testimony from survivors who had witnessed systematic abuse. But the Calcutta papers were more than just an indictment of specific crimes. They were a detailed analysis of how the entire colonial system functioned, complete with organizational charts, financial flows, and decision-making processes that showed how individual acts of cruelty were part of a larger machine designed to extract wealth from India while maintaining the pretense of civilized governance. The papers revealed, for example, how the East India Company's medical policies were designed not to protect public health, but to maintain optimal labor supply levels. Company doctors were evaluated based on their ability to keep workers functional rather than healthy, and medical resources were allocated according to commercial priorities rather than humanitarian needs. One section of the papers documented how Dr. Stevens had conducted experiments on cholera victims, using their suffering to develop more effective methods of maintaining worker productivity during epidemic conditions. These experiments included deliberately exposing healthy workers to contaminated water sources to study infection rates, testing various opium dosages to determine optimal levels for maintaining work capacity among sick employees, and documenting the relationship between malnutrition and disease resistance to establish minimum food rations that would keep workers alive without reducing profit margins. Another section revealed how company officials had systematically looted the possessions of cholera victims, selling everything from clothing to cooking utensils to incoming workers at inflated prices. This practice had generated significant additional revenue for the company, while ensuring that new workers arrived in debt and remained dependent on company-controlled credit systems. The papers also exposed the sexual exploitation networks that Kamala Devi had documented, showing how company officials used medical crises and economic desperation to coerce Indian women into prostitution. These networks weren't informal arrangements between individual men, but organized systems that generated revenue for the company while providing sexual services to British merchants and administrators. Most damaging of all, the papers revealed the extent to which British government officials in London were aware of and complicit in these crimes. Correspondence between company headquarters and colonial administrators showed that the systematic abuse of Indian workers wasn't an unfortunate side effect of commercial operations, but a deliberate policy designed to maximize profits while minimizing administrative costs. Lord William Bentinck, who served as Governor-General of India during the cholera epidemic, had received detailed reports about conditions in the opium warehouses and had explicitly approved policies that prioritized commercial interests over human life. His response to Dr. Morrison's reports about cholera casualties had been to classify them as state secrets and transfer Morrison to prevent further investigation. The Calcutta papers represented something unprecedented in the history of colonial resistance. Previous critics of British rule had relied primarily on moral arguments about the injustice of foreign domination. The resistance network had assembled detailed evidence that proved British rule wasn't just unjust, but actively criminal, complete with documentation that would stand up in any legitimate court of law. But the network faced a fundamental problem in deciding how to use this evidence effectively. Simply publishing the papers in India would accomplish nothing, since the company controlled all local media and could suppress any publication that threatened their interests. Sending copies to London might generate some political pressure, but the British government had already demonstrated its willingness to ignore evidence of colonial abuses when commercial interests were at stake. The solution came from an unexpected alliance with Captain Sarah Mitchell, the former opium merchant who had been driven out of the trade for treating her workers humanely. Mitchell had returned to England with her own collection of evidence about conditions in the opium trade, and she had been working to find sympathetic members of Parliament who might be willing to challenge company policies. Mitchell's credibility as a former insider, combined with her status as a British citizen, gave her access to political circles that would never listen to Indian critics of colonial policy. When she made contact with the Calcutta network through Dr. Morrison's intermediaries, she provided the missing link that could transform their evidence into effective political action. Working together, Mitchell and the network developed a strategy for simultaneous publication of the evidence in London and Calcutta, timed to coincide with parliamentary debates about renewal of the East India Company's charter. The goal wasn't just to expose specific crimes, but to fundamentally delegitimize the entire system of colonial rule by revealing its criminal nature. The strategy required careful coordination across multiple continents, since any premature disclosure would give company officials time to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses. Network members in Calcutta continued gathering documentation, while Mitchell built political support in London, all while maintaining absolute secrecy about their collaboration. As 1833 progressed, the network expanded to include sympathetic Europeans who had witnessed company crimes firsthand. These included merchants like George Pemberton, a former opium trader who had experienced a crisis of conscience after watching entire families die from cholera while company officials counted their profits in nearby warehouses. Pemberton had tried to leave the opium trade after the epidemic, but he discovered that the skills he had developed in managing human exploitation weren't easily transferable to legitimate business. More importantly, he found that his knowledge of company crimes made him a potential threat that needed to be managed or eliminated. Company officials had made it clear that Pemberton's continued health depended on his continued silence about what he had witnessed. When he attempted to establish an independent trading operation, he faced mysterious regulatory obstacles, unexpected tax assessments, and commercial sabotage that made legitimate business impossible. Pemberton eventually concluded that his only option was to join the resistance network and help expose the system that had corrupted him and destroyed so many others. His insider knowledge of company operations, combined with his connections among European merchants, provided crucial intelligence about how the system functioned at its highest levels. Through Pemberton, the network learned about secret agreements between company officials and British government ministers that guaranteed political protection for the opium trade in exchange for a percentage of the profits. These agreements weren't just informal understandings, but written contracts that specified exactly how much money would be paid to which officials in exchange for specific policy decisions. The network also learned about the company's contingency plans for dealing with potential scandals or investigations. These plans included strategies for destroying evidence, eliminating witnesses, and deflecting blame onto lower-level officials who could be sacrificed to protect more important figures. Most importantly, Pemberton revealed that the company was already aware of growing political opposition to the opium trade and was preparing to transition to other forms of exploitation that would be less visible to public scrutiny. The systematic abuse that had characterized the opium warehouses was being replicated in textile manufacturing, agricultural operations, and other industries throughout British India. This intelligence confirmed what network members had suspected. The cholera epidemic and the opium trade weren't isolated problems, but symptoms of a larger system of exploitation that would continue finding new forms unless the entire structure of colonial rule was challenged and destroyed. By late 1833, the network had compiled evidence that implicated virtually every level of the British colonial administration in systematic crimes against the Indian population. They had documented not just individual acts of cruelty, but the institutional frameworks that made such cruelty inevitable and profitable. They had also identified the key vulnerabilities in the system that made it susceptible to exposure and political pressure. The most important of these vulnerabilities was the system's dependence on maintaining the illusion of legitimate governance while engaging in systematic criminality. British rule in India depended on the support of political constituencies in England, who believed they were supporting a civilizing mission that brought progress and prosperity to backward populations. If these constituencies could be shown clear evidence that British rule actually consisted of organized crime on an unprecedented scale, the political foundation of the entire colonial system would collapse. The network's strategy for 1834 was designed to exploit this vulnerability by simultaneously revealing the criminal nature of British rule while demonstrating that the crimes weren't aberrations but essential features of the colonial system itself. The first phase of this strategy involved coordinated publication of evidence in multiple venues, designed to make it impossible for company officials to suppress or control the narrative. The second phase involved organising economic boycotts and political pressure campaigns that would force British politicians to choose between supporting obvious criminality and abandoning their colonial policies. The third phase, if the first two succeeded, would involve supporting armed resistance movements with the intelligence and resources needed to challenge British military control directly. Network members like Arun Bhattacharya had been quietly building connections with disaffected soldiers and potential rebel leaders throughout Bengal and beyond. But the network also understood that their activities had not gone completely unnoticed by company intelligence services. Thomas Wickham had become increasingly paranoid about security breaches and had implemented new surveillance measures designed to identify and eliminate potential threats to company operations. These measures included networks of informants among Indian workers, systematic monitoring of correspondence between India and Britain, and coordination with British military intelligence services that had their own reasons for wanting to suppress evidence of colonial crimes. The race was on between the resistance network's efforts to expose the system and the company's efforts to destroy the evidence and eliminate the witnesses. The outcome would determine not just the fate of individuals like Kumar, Devi, and Bhattacharya, but the future of British rule in India and the millions of people whose lives depended on whether the truth about colonial exploitation would finally be revealed to the world. In the opium warehouses of Calcutta, where the sweet smell of processed drugs still mingled with the lingering stench of death, the stage confrontation that would reshape was set for the relationship between empire and resistance, between profit and human dignity, between the forces that sought to exploit human suffering and those who refused to accept that such exploitation was inevitable. The cholera epidemic had ended, but its legacy lived on in the determination of those who had survived to ensure that the truth about what had happened would not be buried along with the victims. In the narrow alleyways where so many had died alone and forgotten, new alliances were forming that would carry the fight for justice far beyond the boundaries of colonial Calcutta. The empire that opium built was about to face its greatest challenge, not from foreign armies or natural disasters, but from the moral awakening of the very people it had tried to destroy. The sweet smell of processed opium was about to be overwhelmed by something far more powerful. The bitter taste of truth that no amount of money or political influence could suppress forever. The network's carefully laid plans were about to be tested in ways they never anticipated. Because while Kumar, Devi and their associates were gathering evidence in the shadows of Calcutta's opium district, the East India Company was implementing what they called the final solution to the labour problem that had been plaguing their operations since the cholera epidemic. Thomas Wickham had convinced his superiors that the traditional approach of managing Indian workers through a combination of addiction and desperation was no longer sufficient. Too many survivors of the epidemic were asking dangerous questions, and too many witnesses had seen things that could potentially damage the company's reputation if they ever found their way into the wrong hands. The solution Wickham proposed was elegantly simple in its brutality. Instead of trying to manage existing workers who might harbour resentments or possess inconvenient knowledge, the company would systematically replace them with fresh populations who had no connection to the previous disasters and no basis for comparison with better conditions. This policy, which Wickham dubbed workforce renewal, began in earnest during the summer of 1834. Company recruiters spread out across rural Bengal and beyond, targeting villages that had been devastated by famines, floods, or other disasters that left populations desperate enough to accept any terms of employment. But these weren't the relatively straightforward recruitment drives of previous years. Wickham had learned from the cholera epidemic that half measures and gradual exploitation were inefficient. Better to implement comprehensive control systems from the beginning than to risk having workers develop expectations of decent treatment. The new recruits were processed through what the company euphemistically called orientation centres, facilities located on the outskirts of Calcutta, where incoming workers were systematically broken down psychologically before being assigned to their final positions. These centers operated according to principles that would later be recognized as sophisticated programs of psychological manipulation and social control. Let me tell you about Vikram Narayan, a 22-year-old farmer who arrived at one of these orientation centers in August of 1834. Vikram came from a village near Patna that had been wiped out by flooding earlier that year. His entire family had drowned except for his younger sister, who had survived, but was now completely dependent on his ability to find work and send money home. The company recruiters had painted a picture of opportunity and advancement that seemed almost too good to be true. Steady wages, comfortable housing, opportunities for promotion based on merit, and even educational programs that would teach valuable skills for the future. For someone in Vikram's desperate circumstances, it seemed like salvation. The reality began to reveal itself the moment Vikram stepped off the boat at the company's river landing outside Calcutta. He and 47 other new recruits were immediately separated from their personal belongings, which were confiscated for what officials called processing and inventory. They were told these items would be returned once they completed orientation. But Vikram never saw his father's tools or his mother's jewelry again. The men were then marched to a compound surrounded by high walls topped with broken glass. The buildings inside looked like barracks, but the windows had iron bars and the doors could only be opened from the outside. Company officials explained that these security measures were necessary to protect new workers from the dangers of the city until they became familiar with local conditions. Vikram's first night in the orientation center was a revelation of horrors that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. The barracks were overcrowded, with men sleeping on thin mats spread across floors that hadn't been cleaned in months. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and something else that Vikram couldn't identify but would later recognize as the distinctive odor of systematic despair. The other men in the barracks weren't just recent arrivals like himself. Some had been in orientation for weeks or even months, waiting for assignment to work details that never seemed to materialize. These veterans of the system had a hollow look in their eyes that Vikram found deeply unsettling. One of them, a man named Gopal, who had arrived 6 weeks earlier, explained the reality of their situation in whispered conversations after the guards had finished their nightly rounds. The orientation center wasn't a temporary way station before assignment to legitimate work. It was a processing facility designed to break down new recruits psychologically before deploying them in the most dangerous and degrading positions available. The process began with what officials called evaluation, but which was actually a systematic program of humiliation and abuse designed to destroy any sense of self-worth or personal dignity. Men were forced to strip naked and undergo invasive physical examinations that served no medical purpose. They were required to answer detailed questions about their families, their villages, and their personal histories, information that was then used to create psychological profiles that identified potential troublemakers or resistance leaders. Those who showed signs of independence or leadership were marked for special treatment that usually resulted in their disappearance from the center entirely. Gopal had watched dozens of men vanish during his 6 weeks in the facility, and the guards' explanations for these disappearances became increasingly perfunctory over time. Some men were supposedly transferred to other facilities, though no one ever received confirmation that they had arrived safely. Others were allegedly dismissed for medical reasons, though they had shown no signs of illness before their sudden departure. A few were said to have requested early termination of their contracts, though this seemed unlikely, given that leaving meant certain starvation for the families they had come to support. Vikram quickly realized that asking too many questions about these disappearances was itself a form of marked behavior that could result in joining the ranks of the vanished. So he learned to keep his head down, follow orders without question, and avoid any action that might draw unwanted attention from the guards or administrators. But even passive compliance couldn't protect him from the systematic brutalization that was the center's primary function. The daily routine was designed to crush any remnant of human dignity, while preparing workers for the kind of absolute submission that the opium warehouses required. Men were awakened before dawn by guards who used wooden clubs to beat anyone who didn't respond immediately to their commands. They were given exactly 3 minutes to use primitive latrine facilities that served hundreds of men and were never cleaned. Breakfast consisted of thin rice gruel that provided barely enough nutrition to maintain basic biological functions. The morning was devoted to what officials called physical conditioning, but which was actually forced labor designed to exhaust the men while accomplishing no useful purpose. They would carry heavy stones from one pile to another, then carry them back to the original location. They would dig holes, then fill them in, then dig them again. They would scrub floors that were immediately made dirty again by guards who seemed to take pleasure in creating pointless work. Afternoon brought educational sessions where men were required to memorize company regulations, recite loyalty oaths, and participate in group exercises designed to eliminate any sense of individual identity. Those who failed to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm during these sessions faced punishment that ranged from reduced food rations to extended periods in solitary confinement. The psychological impact of this routine was devastating and intentional. Men who had arrived at the center with some sense of personal worth and individual agency were systematically transformed into broken creatures who would accept any treatment rather than risk making their situation worse. Vikram watched this transformation happen to himself and others with a mixture of horror and fascination. He could feel his own personality dissolving under the constant pressure of arbitrary rules, unpredictable punishments, and the ever-present threat of disappearance. The man who had once taken pride in his farming skills and his ability to provide for his family was being replaced by something that was barely recognizable as human. But the most insidious aspect of the process was how it made victims complicit in their own destruction. Men began informing on each other to gain small advantages or avoid punishments. They competed for the guards' approval by demonstrating their willingness to inflict cruelty on their fellow inmates. They developed elaborate justifications for their compliance that allowed them to maintain some semblance of self-respect while participating in their own degradation. Vikram found himself caught in this same psychological trap. When a new arrival asked him about conditions in the center, he found himself repeating the same lies that the guards had told him about temporary hardships and eventual opportunities. When he witnessed another man being beaten for some minor infraction, he felt relief that he wasn't the target rather than sympathy for the victim. This moral corruption wasn't accidental. It was the intended outcome of a system designed to create workers who would be incapable of organized resistance and psychologically prepared to accept any conditions rather than risk returning to the uncertainty of unemployment. After 6 weeks in the orientation center, Vikram was finally selected for assignment to one of the opium processing facilities in central Calcutta. By this point, he was so grateful to be leaving the center that he barely questioned what his new job would entail. Any change seemed like an improvement compared to the systematic torture he had been enduring. The reality was that the orientation center had been preparation for conditions that were even worse. The opium warehouse where Vikram was assigned operated according to principles that made the center's brutality seem almost benevolent by comparison. The work itself was designed to be simultaneously dangerous and addictive. Workers were required to handle raw opium with their bare hands, ensuring that they absorbed significant quantities of the drug through their skin over the course of each shift. This involuntary exposure created physical dependence that made it impossible for workers to leave, even if they wanted to. The processing work also required exposure to toxic chemicals that caused immediate health problems and long-term damage that would eventually prove fatal. Workers developed chronic coughs, skin lesions, and neurological problems that company doctors attributed to constitutional weaknesses rather than occupational hazards. But the most devastating aspect of the work was its psychological impact. The opium processing created a product that the workers knew would destroy the lives of everyone who used it. They were required to participate in the systematic poisoning of entire populations while being poisoned themselves in the process. This knowledge created a form of moral injury that was perhaps more damaging than the physical effects of the work. Men who had once taken pride in productive labor found themselves engaged in an enterprise that created nothing but suffering and death. Vikram's first day in the warehouse was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty disguised as job training. He was assigned to work alongside Raman Gupta, a man who had been processing opium for over 2 years and had developed the hollow-eyed look that characterized long-term workers in the facility. Raman's job was to teach new workers the techniques they would need to survive in the warehouse, but also to indoctrinate them into the psychological frameworks that made such survival possible. He explained not just how to handle the machinery and chemicals, but how to think about the work in ways that wouldn't drive them insane. The key, Raman explained, was to stop thinking of opium as a drug that destroyed lives and start thinking of it as simply another product, like rice or cloth, that happened to be in high demand in foreign markets. The people who used it were making their own choices, and the workers who processed it were simply providing a service that would be provided by someone else if they refused to do it. This rationalization was reinforced by a payment system that rewarded workers based on the quantity and quality of opium they processed, creating financial incentives to produce as much of the drug as possible. Men who might have been horrified by the idea of poisoning strangers found themselves competing with their colleagues to see who could process the most opium in a single shift. The warehouse also operated according to a strict hierarchy that gave workers small amounts of power over those below them while keeping them completely subordinate to those above. This system created the illusion of advancement and opportunity while ensuring that everyone remained trapped within the same exploitative structure. Vikram discovered that he had a natural talent for opium processing that made him valuable to the warehouse supervisors. His farming background had given him skills in handling delicate materials and understanding chemical processes that translated directly to drug manufacturing. Within months, he was being considered for promotion to a supervisory position that would give him authority over newer workers. The promotion came with better housing, higher wages, and access to medical care that was denied to ordinary workers. It also came with the responsibility for implementing the same brutal policies that had been used on him during his own orientation period. Vikram found himself in the impossible position of having to choose between advancing his own circumstances and maintaining his moral principles. If he accepted the promotion, he would become complicit in the systematic abuse of other workers. If he refused, he would remain trapped in conditions that were slowly killing him, while accomplishing nothing to help anyone else. The choice was made even more difficult by letters from his sister, who was depending on the money he sent home to survive. Her situation had deteriorated since his departure, and she was facing starvation, unless he could continue sending regular payments. The promotion would allow him to send more money and potentially arrange for her to join him in Calcutta, where she might find work that would improve both their circumstances. Vikram accepted the promotion, telling himself that he could use his new position to protect the workers under his supervision, while gradually working to improve conditions throughout the facility. These were the same rationalizations that had been used by countless other men who had faced similar choices, and they were just as ineffective for Vikram as they had been for his predecessors. The reality of supervisory work was that it required implementing company policies regardless of their human cost. Vikram found himself responsible for maintaining production quotas that could only be met by pushing workers beyond their physical limits. He was required to enforce discipline measures that he knew were unnecessarily cruel. He had to participate in the selection process that determined which workers would be discarded when they became too sick or too damaged to be profitable. Within 6 months of his promotion, Vikram had become indistinguishable from the supervisors who had brutalized him during his own orientation period. He had learned to see workers as resources to be consumed rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity. He had developed the same hollow-eyed look that he had once found so disturbing in other long-term employees. But Vikram's transformation was being watched by people who understood exactly what was happening and why. Rajesh Kumar and his network of resistance organizers had infiltrated the warehouse system and were documenting the systematic process by which ordinary people were converted into instruments of oppression. Kumar had managed to secure a position as a records clerk in Vikram's warehouse, giving him access to detailed information about worker assignments, mortality rates, and the selection criteria used to identify potential supervisors. What he discovered was a sophisticated system for identifying individuals who could be corrupted and transformed into enforcers of the company's policies. The company had developed psychological profiles that predicted which workers were most likely to accept supervisory positions and implement brutal policies without experiencing complete mental breakdowns. These profiles were based on factors like family obligations, personal ambitions, and previous experiences with authority that made individuals susceptible to moral corruption. Vikram had been identified as a potential supervisor within weeks of his arrival at the warehouse, and his subsequent treatment had been carefully designed to prepare him for the role he would eventually accept. His orientation experience, his work assignments, and even his housing arrangements had all been calculated to create the psychological conditions that would make him willing to participate in the oppression of other workers. This revelation was part of a larger pattern that Kumar's network had been documenting throughout the company's operations. The systematic brutalization they had witnessed wasn't the result of individual cruelty or administrative incompetence. It was the product of carefully designed policies that had been refined over decades to maximize the extraction of labor while minimizing the cost of managing workers. The company had essentially created a machine for converting human beings into instruments of their own oppression, complete with quality control measures, performance metrics, and continuous improvement processes that made the system more efficient over time. Kumar's documentation of this system became a crucial component of the resistance network's evidence collection efforts. They weren't just documenting individual crimes, but revealing the institutional frameworks that made such crimes inevitable and systematic. The evidence showed that the brutality wasn't limited to the opium warehouses, but extended throughout the company's operations in India and beyond. The same psychological manipulation techniques were being used in textile manufacturing, agricultural operations, mining ventures, and every other enterprise where the company needed compliant workers who would accept dangerous and degrading conditions. More importantly, the evidence revealed that this system of systematic oppression was being exported to other parts of the British Empire, creating a global network of exploitation that touched millions of people across multiple continents. The resistance network realized that they weren't just fighting against local abuses in Calcutta, but against a system of institutionalized brutality that threatened to spread throughout the colonial world. Their struggle had implications that extended far beyond the immediate victims of the opium trade. This understanding transformed their approach from documenting specific crimes to exposing the entire logic of colonial exploitation. They began to see their work not just as seeking justice for individual victims, but as challenging the fundamental assumptions that made systematic oppression possible. Kumar's infiltration of the warehouse system also provided the network with intelligence about company security measures and future plans that proved crucial for their survival and effectiveness. He learned that Thomas Wickham had become increasingly paranoid about potential security breaches and was implementing surveillance systems designed to identify and eliminate resistance activities. These systems included networks of informants among the workers, systematic monitoring of all correspondence leaving the warehouse district, and coordination with British military intelligence services. that had their own reasons for wanting to suppress evidence of colonial crimes. The network realized that their window of opportunity for exposing the system was rapidly closing. If they waited much longer, the company's security measures would make it impossible to gather additional evidence or protect the witnesses who had already risked their lives to provide information. The decision was made to accelerate their timeline and begin the process of simultaneous disclosure that would reveal the full scope of company crimes before Wickham's security systems could stop them. This decision would test not just their organizational capabilities, but their commitment to a cause that could easily result in their deaths. The stakes had never been higher, and the opposition had never been more dangerous. But the network had also never been more prepared or more determined to ensure that the truth about colonial exploitation would finally be revealed to the world. In the opium warehouses of Calcutta, where the sweet smell of processed drugs continued to mingle with the stench of human degradation, the final confrontation between empire and resistance was about to begin. The outcome would determine not just the fate of individuals like Vikram, Kumar, and thousands of others, but the future of colonial rule itself. The machine that converted human beings into instruments of their own oppression was about to face its greatest challenge from the very people it had tried to destroy. The question was whether the truth would prove more powerful than the system of lies and brutality that had sustained British rule for so long. As 1834 drew to a close, that question was about to be answered in ways that would reshape the relationship between colonizer and colonized, between those who profited from human suffering and those who refused to accept that such suffering was inevitable. The empire that opium built was about to discover that its greatest weakness wasn't foreign armies or natural disasters, but the moral awakening of the people it had systematically tried to dehumanize. The sweet smell of processed opium was about to be overwhelmed by something far more powerful: the bitter truth that no amount of money or violence could suppress forever. The network's carefully orchestrated plan began to unfold in January of 1835. Just as the winter fog rolled in from the Hooghly River to blanket Calcutta in a grey shroud that seemed to muffle even the screams from the warehouse district. Rajesh Kumar had spent months preparing for this moment, knowing that once they began their coordinated exposure of company crimes, there would be no turning back. The first phase required perfect timing. Captain Sarah Mitchell had secured commitments from 3 members of Parliament who were willing to raise questions about East India Company operations, but only if they had irrefutable documentation to support their accusations. Meanwhile, sympathetic journalists in London had agreed to publish simultaneous exposés, but they needed the evidence to arrive precisely when parliamentary debate was scheduled to begin. Kumar's role was to smuggle the most damaging documents out of Calcutta without triggering the security systems that Thomas Wickham had implemented throughout the warehouse district. This meant using courier networks that had been established by other members of the resistance. People like Priya Mehta, a vegetable seller who moved freely between the European quarter and the Indian neighborhoods while carrying messages hidden in her produce baskets. Mehta had lost her husband during the cholera epidemic, but unlike so many other widows, she had managed to avoid destitution by developing a small trading business that served both British households and Indian workers. Her customers trusted her, and her daily movements through different parts of the city provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering and document smuggling. But Mehta's most valuable asset wasn't her freedom of movement. It was her ability to remain invisible to the British officials who controlled the city. To them, she was just another Indian woman selling vegetables, beneath their notice and unworthy of suspicion. This invisibility allowed her to witness conversations and observe activities that revealed crucial information about company operations. Through Mehta's intelligence network, Kumar learned that Wickham was planning what he called a final cleansing of the warehouse district, designed to eliminate anyone who might possess inconvenient knowledge about company activities. The plan involved staged accidents, mysterious disappearances, and mass transfers to remote locations where potential witnesses could be disposed of without attracting attention. This intelligence forced the network to accelerate their timeline even further. They had originally planned to spend months building their case and ensuring that every piece of evidence was properly verified and documented. Now they had weeks, maybe less, before Wickham's cleansing operation would eliminate most of their sources and destroy the physical evidence they had worked so hard to collect. The pressure was enormous, but it also clarified their priorities in ways that made decision-making easier. Every action had to be evaluated based on a single criterion. Would it help expose the truth before the company could suppress it permanently? This clarity led to some difficult choices. Kumar realized that saving individual lives, while important, was less crucial than preserving the evidence that could prevent future atrocities. When he learned that Vikram Narayan, the former farmer who had become a warehouse supervisor, was scheduled for elimination because of questions he had been asking about worker mortality rates, Kumar had to decide whether to warn him or protect the intelligence sources that had provided the information. The decision was made even more complicated by Kumar's personal feelings about men like Vikram. These were people who had been systematically corrupted by the company's psychological manipulation techniques, but they were also collaborators who had participated in the oppression of other workers. Did they deserve protection, or were they simply casualties of a system they had chosen to serve? Kumar's choice revealed something important about the moral complexity of resistance work. He decided to warn Vikram, not because he deserved salvation, but because saving him might provide access to additional evidence that could help expose the entire system. It was a pragmatic decision disguised as a humanitarian gesture, the kind of moral compromise that resistance work often required. The warning came through Mehta's network, delivered by a child who sold newspapers outside the warehouse gates. The message was simple. Vikram's name was on a list of supervisors scheduled for transfer to a remote facility that existed only on company documents. Everyone who had been transferred to this facility had disappeared without trace. Vikram's reaction to this warning revealed how completely his personality had been transformed by his experiences in the company system. Instead of being grateful for the information or concerned about his safety, his first response was to wonder whether the warning was some kind of test designed to evaluate his loyalty to company policies. This paranoid thinking wasn't unusual among long-term company employees. The systematic psychological manipulation they had experienced made it difficult for them to trust anyone, even people who were trying to help them. They had learned to see potential threats everywhere, while becoming blind to the actual dangers posed by the system they served. But Vikram's paranoia also contained a grain of rational calculation. He knew that accepting help from unknown sources could be interpreted as evidence of disloyalty that would make his situation worse. The company's surveillance systems were designed to detect exactly this kind of unauthorized communication, and being caught receiving warnings from resistance networks would confirm suspicions about his reliability. The psychological trap was perfect. The company had created conditions where potential victims couldn't accept help without confirming their guilt, while refusing help meant accepting whatever fate the company had planned for them. Either choice led to the same outcome: elimination of anyone who might pose a threat to company interests. Vikram's solution was characteristically twisted. He decided to report the warning to his supervisors, presenting it as evidence of his loyalty and his value as a source of intelligence about resistance activities. This would demonstrate his commitment to company interests, while potentially providing information about who was trying to undermine company operations. The decision revealed how completely the system had corrupted his moral reasoning. Vikram was willing to betray people who were trying to save his life in order to prove his loyalty to people who were planning to kill him. The psychological manipulation had been so thorough that he could no longer distinguish between his interests and those of his oppressors. When Kumar learned about Vikram's betrayal through Mehta's intelligence network, his reaction was a mixture of disappointment and resignation. This was exactly the kind of response they had come to expect from people who had been processed through the company's psychological manipulation systems. The corruption wasn't just individual, but institutional, affecting everyone who had been exposed to the system for extended periods. But Vikram's betrayal also provided valuable intelligence about how company security systems operated. His report was processed through a chain of supervisors that revealed the structure of the surveillance network and the procedures used to investigate potential security breaches. More importantly, the company's response to Vikram's report demonstrated that their security measures were becoming increasingly desperate and indiscriminate. Instead of conducting a careful investigation to identify the source of the warning, company officials simply accelerated their plans for eliminating everyone who might be connected to resistance activities. This overreaction created opportunities for the resistance network that hadn't existed before. The company's increasing paranoia was making them sloppy, causing them to take actions that exposed their operations while failing to achieve their security objectives. Kumar realized that they could use the company's paranoia against them by providing carefully crafted disinformation that would trigger overreactions and expose additional intelligence about company operations. This approach was risky because it required predicting how company officials would respond to false information, but it offered the possibility of accelerating their intelligence gathering while disrupting company security measures. The strategy began with a series of false documents that suggested the resistance network was larger and better organized than it actually was. These documents were designed to be discovered by company security services, creating the impression that resistance activities were more widespread and sophisticated than company officials had realized. The documents described fictional resistance cells in other cities, imaginary connections to British political figures, and non-existent plans for coordinated uprisings that would threaten company operations throughout India. None of this was true, but the fiction was carefully crafted to seem plausible while triggering the kind of panicked response that would reveal information about company capabilities and intentions. The reaction was everything Kumar had hoped for and more. Company officials began implementing security measures that were so extensive and disruptive that they interfered with normal business operations. Workers were subjected to increased surveillance that made them resentful and suspicious. Communication systems were restricted in ways that made coordination between different facilities almost impossible. Most importantly, the company began transferring resources away from profitable activities in order to fund security measures that were designed to address threats that didn't actually exist. This created financial pressures that forced officials to make choices between maintaining security and maintaining profitability, choices that revealed their true priorities and exposed vulnerabilities in their operations. The intelligence gathered through this disinformation campaign provided the resistance network with detailed information about company decision-making processes, resource allocation systems, and the personal relationships between key officials. This information was invaluable for planning the coordinated exposure that would reveal company crimes to the world. But the campaign also had unintended consequences that demonstrated the moral complexity of resistance work. The increased security measures made life even more difficult for ordinary workers, who were already struggling to survive under brutal conditions. The paranoid atmosphere created by the false intelligence led to increased violence against anyone suspected of disloyalty, including people who had no connection to resistance activities. Kumar found himself in the uncomfortable position of having created additional suffering for the very people he was trying to help. The strategic success of the disinformation campaign came at the cost of increased oppression for workers who were already bearing the brunt of company brutality. This moral dilemma was complicated by the knowledge that any effective resistance strategy would inevitably create collateral damage among innocent people. The company's system of collective punishment meant that any act of rebellion would result in retaliation against entire communities. But accepting this logic meant accepting permanent subjugation, because any action that might threaten company interests would always result in punishment for innocent people. Kumar's resolution of this dilemma reveals something important about the psychology of resistance work. He decided that the moral responsibility for collateral damage belonged to the system that made such damage inevitable, not to the people who were fighting against that system. This reasoning allowed him to continue his resistance activities while acknowledging their human cost. The logic was sound, but it required a kind of emotional detachment that was psychologically difficult to maintain. Kumar found himself becoming harder and more calculating as the resistance campaign continued, qualities that were necessary for effectiveness, but that also threatened to transform him into the kind of person he was fighting against. This transformation was particularly evident in his relationship with Kamala Devi, the seamstress who had been documenting sexual